A reading from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. And on earth nations will be in dismay, perplexed by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will die of fright in anticipation of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these signs begin to happen, stand erect and raise your heads, because your redemption is at hand. Beware that your hearts do not become drowsy from carousing and drunkenness and the anxieties of daily life, and that day catch you by surprise like a trap. For that day will assault everyone who lives on the face of the earth. Be vigilant at all times and pray that you have the strength to escape the tribulations that are imminent and to stand before the Son of Man." Today's gospel is an example of putting Scripture into a liturgy that has nothing to do with Advent. In actuality, it's a continuation of the apocalyptic or end times passages from the last few weeks. However, in this case, they are using an end times gospel passage in the very first week of the new church year, in this case being cycle A. Although you'd have to sympathize with the inspired people who helped put together all of the readings for the 3-year cycle around 2,000 years ago, taking a gospel passage that fits for the end of the church year and putting it at the beginning of the new church year, while trying to apply it to the beginning of Advent is, in my opinion, a stretch at best. The major point of this gospel passage is, as in prior weeks, you do not know when the Lord is coming, so we need to stay awake. Or, in the case of this gospel, be vigilant at all times. For the Catholic Church, it's not so hard to see what point they're trying to make. We need to prepare for Christ's coming. That is the point of the Advent season. It's a penitential season where we focus inward on ourselves as we begin to prepare for the birth of Christ. This, of course, makes complete sense. We should focus on the meaning of Jesus coming into the world. What did it mean to the first century Jewish world? And, most importantly, what does it mean for us? These are questions that are very important in this Advent season. However, is this gospel passage actually about preparing for the birth of Christ? Absolutely not. In reality, this passage is talking about the second coming of Christ at the end of days, where the have-nots get all the power, whereas the powerful are put in the place of the have-nots. In other words, this is an instance where we take this gospel passage out of context, but with good reason. For religious scholars, we have a fancy term for taking a gospel out of context, but usually with good reason. And the term is called eisegesis, meaning interpreting a text by reading into it one's own ideas. For those who know Latin, the word literally means to lead into, which opens the story to interpretation. If at this point you're confused, here is an example. In the Jewish Bible, the Jews fleeing Egypt from slavery often has parallels to history of slavery in America. For African Americans, the Jews fleeing Egypt leads into recalling stories of their ancestors being taken from their countries, shipped and enslaved in America, and fleeing persecution by means of the Underground Railroad. That is an example of good eisegesis. Now, if we were to try and say that the story of the Jews fleeing Egypt is actually about slavery in America, that would be an example of bad eisegesis. Applying this to today's gospel, we are using eisegesis to create a parallel to Christ's second coming and the birth of Jesus, his first coming. Can this gospel passage lead us into interpretations of Advent? Absolutely. Is today's gospel actually about Advent and preparing for the birth of Jesus? Absolutely not. If we pull from the sources, aka the first century context where this gospel was written, we can objectively see that today's gospel is about preparing for the second coming of Christ. And the fancy term that religious scholars use for pulling from the sources is called exegesis. So we have exegesis, pulling from the sources, and eisegesis, which is leading into a new interpretation from one's own ideas. So as we begin this Advent season, a good way to prepare for the coming of Christ is to, as my favorite religious scholar Marcus Borg calls it, reading the Bible again for the very first time. The way we do this is to read the Bible using exegesis by pulling from the sources in an attempt to read it as objectively as possible. In addition, we can notice how an objective read of Scripture might lead us into seeing the gospel through our own life experience. However, we need to know that using this eisegesis is not, nor will it ever be, what the gospel story is really about. The gospels are not about us and our personal interpretations. They are first and foremost about the community, the evangelist,